Ever thought about sending your voice across the globe with just a radio? Well, it's not magic. It's amateur radio. In this quick explainer, we're going to demystify some of the core concepts and turn that technical jargon into ideas you can really sink your teeth into. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle the rules of the radio, getting licensed and all that. Then we'll get into the cool science of crafting your signal. After that, it's all about antennas, your gateway to the airwaves. And finally, we'll wrap up with the really important stuff, safety and on-air etiquette. All right, first things first. Before you can even think about hitting that transmit button, there's a little hurdle, the license. So let's talk about the rules of the road that keep the airwaves open and legal for everybody. So, who actually gives you the test? You might think it's some government office, right? Nope. The whole system relies on a community of experienced operators called volunteer examiners. They're the ones accredited to help bring new folks into the hobby. Okay, but what happens if life gets in the way and your license expires? Don't sweat it too much. You've got a 2-year grace period to renew. But if you wait longer than that, you'll have to jump through a couple of hoops, show proof you had the old license, and pass the current technician exam to get back on the air. And, the rules also get really specific about power. Take beacon stations, for example. These are automated transmitters that basically test the weather for radio waves, letting people know how signals are propagating. Well, they're capped at a pretty strict 100 watts of peak envelope power. Okay, rules are out of the way. Now for the fun stuff, the science. Let's get into what it actually takes to craft that perfect signal that can travel the world. When you're listening in on the bands, you'll hear operators throw around a lot of terms about signal quality. And there's one common problem that has this really descriptive name. It's called flat topping. And it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the radio equivalent of shouting into the mic. You're just pushing your equipment too hard, it can't handle it, and it literally clips the top off the radio wave. That's what causes all that nasty distortion. So how do you avoid that? Well, a big part of it is being efficient. To steer clear of distortion and just make the best use of the airwaves, operators often use what's called single sideband, or SSB. It's amazing, really, because it squeezes your voice into the tightest possible space. And the way these radio waves travel, it's just wild. They can literally bounce off the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere, and land hundreds of miles away. But that creates these dead zones called skip zones, where you normally can't be heard. But here's where it gets really cool. There's this phenomenon called scatter that can actually fill in those gaps by reflecting signals off the atmosphere. Now, to really get a handle on your signal, you have to understand how much power you might be losing along the way. We measure this in decibels, or dB. So let's just imagine your antenna cable loses 1 dB. Doesn't sound like a lot, right? Well, let's see what that actually means in the real world. The formula here is basically a translator. It helps us turn that abstract 1 dB lost into a concrete percentage. All we're doing is rearranging things to solve for how much power actually gets to the antenna compared to what we started with. And check this out. That tiny little 1 dB loss, it translates to losing over 20% of your power before it even gets to the antenna. That is huge. It just goes to show how every single component in your setup matters. Seriously, it can be the difference between someone hearing you loud and clear or your signal just fading into noise. All right, so we've talked about the signal. Now let's talk about the single most critical piece of hardware that actually sends it out and brings others in. Of course, I'm talking about the antenna. Now, getting your antenna and your radio to play nicely together is absolutely crucial for efficiency. And that brings up a really important question about a little piece of gear that makes this perfect handshake possible. And the answer is all about something called impedance matching. I love this analogy. Think of it like connecting a garden hose to a spigot. If the threads don't match, you get water spraying everywhere, right? It's the same idea. An impedance matching transformer makes sure you have a perfect, tight connection, so all the power gets out where it's supposed to. So, you want to boost your signal, but you don't want to just crank up the power. Here's a really clever trick. If you literally stack 2 directional antennas, one on top of the other, you can double your effective power in whatever direction they're pointing. That's a 3 dB gain, and trust me, that can make a massive difference. But, even testing your setup isn't always cut and dry. Even a purpose-built tool like an antenna analyzer can get thrown off. If there's a strong signal nearby, say from a big broadcast tower or even another ham operator, it can totally mess with the readings. Okay, let's bring this all together. Because being a great radio operator is about so much more than the tech. It's about being safe, being responsible, and just being a good neighbor on the airwaves. And let's start with a danger that's very real, but completely invisible. We're talking about RF energy. It can actually build up on metal stuff in your shack, in your station. And if you're not properly grounded, just touching your microphone could give you a really nasty RF burn. Thankfully, manufacturers are well aware of the high voltages inside this gear. That's why they build in safety features called interlocks. You can think of them as an automatic kill switch. The second you open the cabinet, they cut the power, protecting you from some really dangerous stuff inside. And beyond the physical safety, there's a whole code of conduct for when you're on the air. You know, if you want to join a conversation, you don't just interrupt. You simply say your call sign once. There are also these accepted practices, like which sideband to use on certain frequencies, and even a shorthand to describe signals, like adding a C if a signal sounds chirpy. You know, we've really just scratched the surface here. Amateur radio is this huge world that mixes technical skill, community service, and connecting with people globally. It's basically a license to learn and explore. So, after all this, the only real question is, where do you want to start?